I'm fascinated about the idea, again, that Socrates and Plato both thought that the real work of philosophy, it wasn't mere intellectual rumination. It was about living life.
Yes.
And that idea has been lost, basically. I mean,
Well, it's been lost from philosophy.
from philosophy.
But it's not been lost from religion. And I think this is something we've already almost touched on, so I should talk about that a little bit. Religion in ancient Greece was largely ritualistic. It was the performance of the proper rites, taking part with the rest of your community in certain festivals, or the rest of your tribe, or the rest of your group of soldiers in certain festivals, and doing stuff at home, maybe tossing some grain onto the fire as a sacrifice in the morning and stuff like that. I mean, that obviously was based on a kind of a bedrock of belief. You had to believe that the gods exist, that they have the power to, intervene in the world for better or for worse, and so on and so forth. So there's a bedrock of beliefs, but it wasn't really belief. There was no creed. There was no that you had to believe in order to be orthodox. There was no church to say what was and wasn't orthodox, and so on and so forth. So there was really no place in ancient Greek religion there were some for if anybody wanted to become a better person, wanted to develop his or her potential. There were some mystical sects which perhaps went somewhere along those paths, but we know so little about them that it's really quite hard to be certain. But it was the philosophers who stepped in and filled that lack. They were the ones who were trying to provide the tools for people to become better people. And this is perhaps, it's pretty obvious in Plato, but it's even more obvious when you think about people like the Stoics. People like Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, the later Stoics, were, very clearly using philosophy as a framework to guide others towards a better way of life.
But even that idea, it's a very sophisticated idea. You don't think of a primitive culture. I don't think of Neolithic people thinking about how can I be a better Neolithic man. It's an idea that suddenly seems to appear.
Yeah.
Among the Greeks.
Yes. As far as I know, I don't know enough about it. There's tons of work being done at the moment on Mesopotamian literature, which is earlier and things like that, and I don't know enough about it to be absolutely certain. But yeah, it does appear, as far as I know, among the Greeks. Pre-Socratics first, again.
Who didn't know they were pre-Socratic?
Who didn't know.
Think of the irony. Well,
not all of them were. Some of them contemporaneous with Socrates.
Some of them pre-Socratics were not pre-Socratics. You write about Plato's disillusionment after the death of Socrates. Can you just touch on that?
Okay. Plato came from a well-born family, rich, landed estates, generations of wealth. The natural course for him would have been for him to enter public life, was the way the Greeks put it. We would say become a politician, which is from the age of 20 he could address the Athenian assembly. From the age of 30 he could become a councillor, and so on. And maybe even progress and become as important a politician as somebody like Pericles, the statesman. That was a natural thing for him to do, and indeed letter 7, that important long letter that I mentioned earlier, starts off by saying, yes, that's what I was going to do. I was going to become a politician. Now, it's not just Socrates' death. I need to go back a little bit. When Athens lost the Peloponnesian War, you know this, they lost it to Sparta. When Athens lost the Peloponnesian War, the Spartans imposed on them a narrow oligarchy of 30 men who quite rapidly, because of their brutality, became known as the 30 Tyrants. Now, the most prominent member of the 30 was a cousin of Plato's, a cousin in another generation, you know how it goes. And another very prominent member was his uncle, his mother's brother. And several others of the 30 had been in the Socratic circle, and were certainly known to Plato. He says in Letter 7 that, he was attracted to doing some work for the 30 because they were friends and relatives. But he got put off by their savagery. And so he decided he wouldn't work for the 30. The 30 tyrants didn't last very long. Their regime lasted only, 11 months or something. And then the democracy was restored. So Plato then thought, maybe I can work within the renewed democracy. But before very long, the renewed democracy had taken Socrates to court. And to tie things together, almost certainly the main reason they took him to court was precisely because members of his circle had been among the 30. And Socrates himself was, under the 30, was in a privileged position. The 30 disarmed all Athenian citizens and threw them out of the city. But Socrates was allowed to stay. There were 3,000 people who were allowed to stay. So he was kind of in a slightly ambiguous position as regards the 30. I'm sure he didn't like them. And there's a famous story that they asked him to do a particular job to arrest somebody, and he refused, for which he could, of course, have got into a lot of trouble. But nevertheless, there was this slight ambiguity. Was he or wasn't he, So I think what happened at the trial, we don't have the prosecutor's speeches, but I'm pretty sure at the trial they made Socrates out to be the kind of eminence grise of the 30, a sort of a shadowy figure in the background who was...
Now, that being very ignorant of all these things, I can say that it's surprising to me that he would have been thought of as close to power in that way.
Well, remember what I said earlier, that the main project of both Socrates and Plato was political, was to create a generation of responsible, competent, principled statesmen who would run Athens and, have an effect in the wider world as well. So I think from that point of view, it falls a bit more into place that Plato would have been interested.
Talk a little bit about Plato's Academy.
Right.
This is after the death of Socrates.
Yes, quite a bit after. Socrates died in 399. Plato founded the Academy in 383. Right, so the Academy... Okay. First of all, I think I should say that the term philosophy meant something quite different then from what it does now. What it meant then was what it meant up until about 200 years ago, where philosophy was a kind of a blanket term for everything. If you did mathematics, you were a philosopher. If you did what we would now call psychology, you were a philosopher. If you did geography, you were a philosopher, right? And it was like that in ancient Greece as well. Philosophy was, covered a lot of different disciplines that we would now separate. So, So there were some people who took philosophy seriously, people like Plato and Socrates, but there were many, many others who would go to attend a philosopher's lectures to kind of round off their higher education. They'd perhaps been studying under a rhetorician, and then they would go and attend a few lectures by Plato or Antisthenes or some other philosopher. So a great deal of the teaching that went on in the Academy, this school that Plato started in 383, was of that fairly superficial level. These were kids, age 17, 18, 19, walking, commuting out from Athens to the Academy, which was just a couple of kilometers out to the northwest, and attending a lecture because they felt that was the way to sort of, hone their minds a bit. They weren't going there to be professional philosophers or to take this thing seriously at all. And that kind of teaching went on in the Academy Gymnasium. However, Plato also bought a plot of land near the Academy Park and built a house in it. And what went on there was really more the heart of the Academy than this rather superficial teaching in the gymnasium, because there was where the researchers, the senior Academy members, met and did their research. And it was the research that was going on in the Academy that was more interesting than its teaching. The Academy is more the ancestor of All Souls College, Oxford, than it is a teaching university. All right? There were other another contemporary school by a man called Socrates was really the ancestor of our universities. But the academy did research which, I mean, in a huge range of fields. I mean, Aristotle was in the academy for 20 years. And if anybody's even glanced at Aristotle's titles, and that's only about a third of his books, 2/3 lost, then, he covers pretty much every subject under the sun, as it was then. And that's representative of the kind of research that was going on in the academy. There was a lot of high-level mathematics going on, but there was everything else. They were doing history and geography and even, early science, biology. There's a fascinating fragment of a comic poet called Epicrates, which has some people from the academy, he names some of them, standing around wondering what the genus of a certain plant is. Until Plato comes, they all get it muddled up, and it's supposed to be, I suppose, vaguely comic, until Plato comes along and says, start again, have another go. But, there we see them actually doing some taxonomy, doing some primitive science or some early science, let's say. So great deal of research was going on in the academy the first solid geometry was probably being done there. The first quasi-plausible models of how the universe works were developed there, and a great deal of other work. And also, interestingly, political work. The academy, because it had the reputation of having like the sort of cream of the intellectuals of Greek society, if a state was in trouble, a state anywhere in the Greek world, I'm thinking of two at least in Asia Minor straight away, would approach the academy and say, look, can you help out? And so Plato would send one of the academicians to that place to perhaps revise its constitution, but sometimes to do more drastic things.
That's so rational that it's almost funny. It is funny to me that they would reach out to the academy for, can you send us a political consultant to help us think this through?
Yeah. Are you going to Delos on your tour?
Are we going to Delos?
Yeah.
Not if I can help it. Man, I hate that place. No, I'm kidding. I don't know anything about Delos. Why would we go to Delos?
I don't know. No, I was only going to trigger off that too, because the Delians approached the academy. They said, look, they had offended Apollo in some way, and Apollo had sent a drought or something. And except the oracle of Apollo said, the drought will go away if you double the size of my altar. And the altar was a perfect cube. Now, I'm no mathematician, but I'm told that doubling a cube is really tricky. And so the Delians approached the academy and said, look, can you help us solve this problem? We want to get rid of our drought. And so some of the academicians found ways to double the cube.
And after all that work, turns out Apollo doesn't even exist. How sad. I have to ask you about, whenever anybody talks about Plato or thinks about Plato, they think about the forms, the Platonic idea. It's fascinating to me that Plato was, you talk about it, but expand on it a little bit. You talk about it in the book about the idea that he was anti-materialist in a sense. In other words, that he was always trying to drive, and that's kind of a Gnostic or dualistic idea that, what's here is not as good as what is, I don't know what you'd call it, more ethereal or the divine somehow. There's another realm, and this realm is not what that realm is, and that the whole idea of philosophy is to get there. And of course, there's truth in that. But it was interesting to me that he was that they were enemies of materialism, or at least talk about what that means. What in other words, what was it when he's talking about the forms versus actual things?
The type of materialism, I imagine there are different types of materialism. The type of materialism that bothered him was the pre-Socratic type. There were, as you know, pre-Socratics who were claiming that everything in the world, every piece of furniture of the world, is actually a different manifestation of an underlying material substrate. All right, so a chap called Anaximenes said that in the beginning there was air, and that everything in the world is a result of either the thinning or the thickening of air. Okay, so Plato didn't like that. He didn't like the idea.
But he didn't like it not because it wasn't true, but he didn't like the theory of it.
Didn't like it being based just entirely on a material thing. And by the same token, he didn't like, because a materialist has also to rely entirely on mechanical causation. One thing, the other thing, like that. And he didn't like that either. So yeah, he was opposed to materialism. He was opposed to skepticism. He believed the truth was there to be found.
Well, that's what I mean. It's fascinating that he believed there's such a thing as truth.
Yeah.
And that he believed there was something beyond this world. Let's put it in more contemporary terms.
Yeah.
He believed that there was something beyond this world.
Yeah.
He calls it the plane of truth.
Yeah.
We might call it eternity or the world beyond this world, the supernatural or something like that. But he was convinced that that's where the forms.
Yeah, but we're touching on very controversial area of Platonic studies here. It's very easy to read him and say he had a two-world theory, this world, the world of forms. But at the same time, it's also clear from his writing that you never get to know or even to glimpse the world of forms except through this world. So in fact, we only ever see... He says that in some pre-incarnate existence, we have glimpsed the plane of truth. Our souls have glimpsed the plane of truth. But as incarnate beings, we can only know this world, and we only glimpse the forms through this world. The easiest and most accessible form is the form of beauty. So every time you see someone or something as beautiful, you are seeing the form of beauty, because otherwise how would you identify that as beautiful? That's Plato's theory. You have no way of identifying something except through these forms, these attributes, which are what they are, whereas nothing else is what it is perfectly. Anything that I call beautiful in this world is not going to remain beautiful, or it's not going to be beautiful to another person, or so on and so forth. But the forms are just beauty itself. But every time we see somebody as beautiful, we are seeing a form, or an instantiation of the form, a reflection of the form. So I don't know whether he had a completely, as it were, divisive two-world theory, because the worlds have, actually come together as they, I guess, must.
If you think these conversations are valuable, would you do us a favor and please like this video and subscribe to this channel? When you do that, you help us get these conversations out to a wider audience by telling YouTube that people are interested in this. Also, you can go to SocratesInTheCity.com, sign up for our newsletter, and you can check back every week. There's new stuff here every week. Thank you for tuning in.